Hey guys, and welcome to Graphic Designer Pro. In this video, I'm going to take you through 3 different techniques to create distorted textures in Adobe Photoshop 2021. We'll also show you how you can apply these textures to your designs to give them that rough, eroded look. You can also download a free template file from the description below that you can use to follow along with this tutorial. If you enjoy this video, then hit the like button and subscribe for more weekly design content. Okay guys, let's head onto the computer now and get started. Okay, so here we are in our template file, and we already have a few layers set up that we are going to apply our textures to. But before that, we are actually just going to start by creating one of the textures themselves. So this is probably what you will be doing. You'll create them separately, and then you can bring them into any one of your design files and apply them from there. So that's the beauty of this. These are completely reusable, and you can basically build up a bank of these textures and potentially even sell your own texture packs. So the first technique we're going to look at requires us to create a new layer. So I'm just going to do that. Let's add a new layer, and I'm just going to give this a fill color of white. So if I click this little icon, that's going to set our default foreground and background colors, which will be black and white. And then I can click the double-ended arrow to make sure my foreground color is white, because we just want to create a completely white layer here. Now what I'm going to do next is convert this to a smart object. So what this means is that when I start applying the filters that we're going to be applying in a second, I can go back and edit and manage them separately instead of having to undo and reapply them. So this is very useful, and it comes in very handy with this technique that we're going to be looking at. So the first filter I want to apply is clouds. So we can do that by going up to filter in the top menu, down to render, and you'll see at the top of the list here we have clouds. So I'm going to click this, and this is the result we get. Now, depending on your foreground and background colors, this may look different. I would always recommend keeping your foreground color white and your background color black to get this same look. If your background color was a lighter gray, for example, the darker areas in this effect would be that grey colour, if that makes sense. So we're going to get the most contrast this way, and like I say, because we've set our layer up as a smart object, we actually have our cloud effect listed here that we can go back and adjust afterwards, which is what we'll do in this case. From here though, I'm going to go back up to filter, we're going to go down to pixelate, and then we're going to select the mezzotint option. So this is basically going to apply a grainy effect to our layer, and from this drop down we actually have a few options, and it may vary which option you select depending on the size of canvas you're working on. And that's another thing to note, is that I would always recommend creating these textures in a large canvas size. We're using 1920 by 1080 pixels in this example. To be honest, that's probably the minimum size I would recommend, but essentially the larger the size and the more resolution, the more detail you'll be able to achieve. Especially if you're using these for print work, I'd recommend a 300 ppi document as well. But in this case, I'm going to start by selecting coarse dots. So that's going to create quite large blocky areas of black and white when I click OK, which you will see now. But again, we can go and adjust this afterwards. So already this is actually looking quite good, but we can smooth and refine this out a little bit more by applying one more filter. So I'm going to go back up to filter, and this time I'm going to select filter gallery. So let's click on that. And from the right hand side we have a few drop downs. You want to make sure that the sketch folder is dropped down, and we're going to select this option that says stamp. So if I do that, it's going to basically simplify our mezzotint out, and it's also going to smooth out a lot of these areas. Now we have a few sliders to play around with here to fine tune this. The one at the top that says light/dark balance isn't really going to have any effect unless you take it right down to 0, in which case it will all be black, or the opposite end 50, it's all going to be white. But anything in between, it's not actually going to make any difference because we're just dealing with white and black areas. There's no greys or any mid-tones to adjust, so that doesn't really matter. The smoothness slider, however, does make a bit of a difference. If I drag this up, you can see the darker areas are getting more simplified and larger. If I take this back the other way, it's going to create a slightly finer look. So I'm going to leave this at about 3 for this example, but again, we can just fine tune this as we go. So I'll click click OK, and this is the base effect that we've created, although I'd say this still needs a bit of work to be usable. So at the moment we've probably got too much contrast between the dark and white areas. So what I can do is go back over to my layers. We have our 3 filters being applied here, and like I say, we can go back and adjust these. So on the clouds layer, I'm going to go over to the right hand side where we have this icon, double click on this. We're going to get a warning here to say that the filters stacked on top aren't going to preview when we adjust this, but that's fine. I can just click don't show again and click OK. And basically from here, all I'm really looking to adjust is the opacity of this layer. So we can make this cloud effect much more subtle. We could take the opacity down to about 30%. And really the point of this clouds layer is just to create a little bit more randomness in the texture we're creating, so it's not quite as consistent across the whole canvas. So you can see this is drastically changing the look of this. Now it's probably best if I go and adjust some of the other effects. So I could double click on the word mezzotint again. We're going to get our mezzotint pop up, and instead of coarse dots I could change this to one of the others. We could go up to fine dots. I'll maybe try medium dots in this case. Click OK, and that's creating slightly more detail. Again, let's go back into our filter gallery, stamp effect, and we could adjust the smoothness a little bit more. What's happening here is we're getting a lot more dark areas, but to be honest that's not an issue in this case. What I'm going to do is go for something quite subtle. We'll go with about that. Click OK. And what we're going to be doing next is applying this texture to a design. The way we're going to be applying these textures is through layer masks. And basically how these work is that they can be applied to any layer, and any light areas or white areas within the mask is going to show the content of that layer, and any dark or black areas is going to hide the content of the layer. So we'll be able to show this a little bit more clearly in a second, but in this case we have a lot of dark areas, so most of the layer that we're going to apply this to is going to be hidden, which isn't really what we want. We only want the smaller sections to be removed from our design. So a very easy way to fix this is just to invert this, and to do that the shortcut is Command I, or that's Control I on a PC. So you can see this is much better. This is the kind of thing we are really looking for. Now I can go and adjust this a little bit more. I could go back into my clouds, for example, maybe take this down to 20%, take the contrast of these areas down a little bit more, and really you can fine tune these things to your heart's content. I'm quite happy with this as an example. So in your case, if you were creating this separately to build up a texture pack, for example, you could just export this as an image, a PNG for example, but I'm just going to go straight ahead and apply this to a design. So to do that, what I'm going to do first is press Command A, and that's basically going to make a selection of the canvas, and it's going to select everything on the layer we have selected. Now I'm going to just copy this with Command C. That's Control A and Control C if you're on a PC, by the way, and I'm just going to hide the visibility of this layer for now. Now if I go back down in my layers panel, we have a few design layers set up here, so I'm just going to enable the visibility of our first design here, and now we need to apply a layer mask to this. So to do that, I simply need to go down to the bottom of the layers panel. We have this icon that looks like a rectangle with a circle in it. If I just click that, that's automatically applying a layer mask. Now you'll see in the layer itself, the layer mask preview is all white, and that's because the full layer is being displayed. So as I said before, any white in the layer mask is going to show the pixels within that layer, any black is going to hide, any grayscale shades, depending on how dark or light it is going to basically adjust the transparency of those pixels. So what we can do is actually go into our layer mask view. So to do that, I'm holding Option on a Mac, or it will be Alt on a PC. Click on the layer mask thumbnail on the layer. So if I do that, you'll see we just get taken to a white canvas. This is the contents of our layer mask. From here, I can simply paste in our texture. So Command V or Control V on a PC. This is pasted in. If I just click on the layer again, we'll go back to our normal view. So we now have this texture applied where we have the black areas, the sort of splatter is hiding those sections of this design. So very easy to apply. What I could do is, again, holding Option, let's go back in here, and I'm just going to switch to my selection tool. Now I have this Show Transform Controls checked up in my control panel, so I'm actually getting these handles because we still technically have our selection. If you don't, just hit Command A again, make sure that's checked, or you can also press Command T to get these transform handles. And I'm just going to slightly scale this effect down so that it's a little bit more fine on the design itself. So we'll go with something like that. I can click out that, and I think that's fitting a little bit better. So this is quite a subtle one. Again, this is something that maybe just takes a little bit of trial and error. Now, another thing that you can do with a design like this is to actually stop the texture going to the very edges of the design. This is something that I think can make them look a little bit nicer. Where we have the texture going to the edge of the design, it can look a little bit jarring at times. It doesn't work quite as well. In this case, because the texture is quite subtle, it's maybe not as obvious. So what I could do to show this a little bit more clearly would be to turn on our texture layer again, and I'll double click on filter gallery again. So let's just reveal a little bit more texture by bringing my smoothness slider down. We'll go something like that. Click OK. So again, let's press Command A, Command C to copy it. We'll go into the layer mask. Let's hide the visibility of that layer first. So into the layer mask, holding Option, click on the layer mask. And if I simply press Command V again, that's just going to paste over the top. So that's fine. And I could adjust the size of this again in the same way that we've just demonstrated. So we'll go with something like that. Click out again, and you can see we've got a lot more texture applied in this case. So that's quite easy just to go back and make an adjustment. Now, to stop this texture going to the edges, there's another step we can take. So what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate this design layer. First, I'm just going to press Command D, or that's Control D on a PC, just to deselect our selection that we had there. Now I'm going to press Command J, or that's Control J on a PC, to duplicate this layer, and I can just delete the mask from this duplicated layer. So I'm going to right click and then select Delete Layer Mask. Now I'm going to double click on the layer itself, and what we want to do is create a stroke around the edge of the design. So you'll see we have this stroke option here, and there's a few things we want to do with this. First of all, I'm making sure that the position is set to inside, so it's not featuring on the outside of the text at all. I've got my blend mode set to normal and my opacity to 100%, and you can play around with the size. This is going to depend on the size of the design itself. In this case, 4 pixels works quite well, so I can simply go ahead and click OK. Now what we want to do is bring this white stroke into our mask. The only issue is that we don't want any of the other pixels, so the pixels making up the design on this layer. So with that layer still selected, what I can do is go up to this fill value, click on the drop down and take the fill down to 0%. So that's basically getting rid of everything except the stroke that we have applied. Next, I need to rasterize this layer. So it only works if I rasterize the effects. So to do that, I just need to right click on the layer and click on this option that says rasterize layer style. So that's basically just converting those stroke pixels into the layer itself. And then it's the exact same technique that we've just used. So I'm going to press Command A and then Command C, and that's only going to copy the pixels on the layer we have selected. I can press Command D now to deselect that. I can just hide that layer now. I don't need it. Holding Option, let's click on our layer mask again, so we're brought back into the layer mask, and then press Command V to paste that stroke in. And because we set this stroke to white, it is going to show the image and basically hide any of the texture that we had put into this layer mask as well. So again, Command D to deselect. I'll click on the layer itself, and it's quite subtle really, but you'll notice that we don't have any of this texture going to the very edges of the design, and I think this just gives for a slightly cleaner and more professional look. Now the beauty of masks as well is that we can go and fine tune this further if we want to. I could simply grab my brush tool and making sure that we have the hardness set to 100%, and I've also got my opacity and flow set to 100%. I could hide more areas of this texture if I wanted to, so I need to make sure that my foreground color is set to black. Also make sure that you click on the layer mask in your layers panel, and I could go and hide elements of this texture if I wanted to simplify areas, for example. It's really easy to do, and this is completely non-destructive as well. So we're not actually deleting elements of our design at all. So that's basically it for our first technique. The second texture we're going to create basically follows the exact same principles. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of that layer for now. Let's create a new layer again, and same as before, we're going to give this a white fill. So just with my paint bucket tool, making sure the foreground color is set to white, and we're going to do the exact same thing, convert this to a smart object, and I'm also going to apply a clouds filter to this as well. So let's click filter, go down to render, and then clouds. It's going to do the exact same thing, and this time we're going to basically create a halftone effect. Now I think a halftone effect can still be used really well in a distressed looking design by using this technique. So again, we're going to get quite a random looking effect with thanks to this clouds filter. So there are a few ways we can apply a halftone effect to this. The first one is to go up to filter, down to pixelate, and then color halftone. And from here, you want to make sure that all of your channel values are the same. Now I like to use 45 degrees as I think this gives the most natural look in this case. You can also adjust your max radius, and this is basically going to adjust how large or small the halftone dots that get created are. So if I click OK, this is the general effect we're getting. Now this works fairly well. Again, we maybe have a little bit too much contrast in our clouds filter, so I can do the same thing of double clicking on that and adjusting the opacity. We could take this down to 40%, for example, hit enter, and that's going to be much more subtle, which I quite like. Another option, if I just turn off the visibility of that halftone effect, is to go up to filter, back to our filter gallery, and under the same sketch drop down, we have a halftone pattern option. So I'm going to click that, and we have a few sliders to play around with here as well, so we can actually fine tune this one a little bit more easily than the last technique. So we can adjust the size of the dots. We also have a contrast value, which is going to do just that, add or take away contrast. What's cool about this effect as well is that we don't just have to use a halftone dot. So if I drop this down, we also have a line option that's going to create horizontal lines at varying widths, and we also have a circle option. Now the circle option is pretty cool, but again, how detailed it is going to depend on the size of the canvas you're working with as well. So just be aware that you may have to play about with these to get them working in a way that suits you. So I could go with something like this. Let's click OK, and this could work quite well, although there is quite a lot going on. Now my personal favorite way of doing this is to convert our image to a bitmap. Now again, this is best if you're doing this in a separate file and not the same file as your designs, but in this case I'm just going to show you how to do this in the same file to show you that it can be done. So I'm going to press Command Z, go back to our layer with just the clouds effect applied. I might actually make the clouds a little bit more subtle still. Let's drop this down to even just 30% or so is fine. Now what I have to do to create a bitmap is flatten all of my layers. So that's obviously not ideal, and I'll show you how I get around this. So what we need to do is go up to image, down to mode, and we need to change this to be grayscale instead of RGB or CMYK. So let's do that first. It's going to ask if we want to merge the layers. We have to in the next step regardless, so I'm just going to go ahead and click merge this time, and you can see over my layers panel everything has been flattened onto a single layer. Now let's go back up to image, go back to mode, and this time we get the bitmap option available. So if I click this, it's going to ask us if we want to flatten the layers. They've already been flattened, but I'll just click OK, and then we get this pop-up. Now what we want to choose from the method drop down is halftone screen. We have a few other options, but this is the one we want to select in this case. I'm just going to leave my output at 72 pixels per inch, but you can adjust this and add more resolution if you want to. Click OK, then we get taken to a halftone screen pop-up, and this is where we can actually set our values. So the benefit of this is that again, we have an option to choose from a round halftone pattern, or we have things like diamonds and lines, which is also really cool. I actually really like the line option in this case. I can set the angle of those lines and also the frequency, so that's going to adjust how big those lines appear. Let's just keep this at 10 for the time being and click OK, and you can see the kind of effect that we get created. So this is quite subtle, and I personally prefer this method of creating a halftone pattern. The only issue is that we can't just go and adjust this on the fly. I would have to press Command Z and go back and do it again. So again, back up to image, mode, bitmap, flatten layers, click OK, and we can go and adjust this. I could maybe up this to 16 lines per inch, and this time let's change this to be round, for example. Click OK, and this is the effect we get. So I like this, and essentially we're ending up with another black and white image that we can use as a texture. So again, if you were creating this separately, you could just save this image down and start using it. In this case, I'm going to do the exact same thing that we did in the last technique. Press Command A to make a selection, Command C to copy it, and now it's a case of just going back. So I'm just going to press Command Z a few times. You can go to your history panel as well and go back that way, and I've basically gone back to our original clouds layer here. Let's just turn that off, and let's enable the visibility of our design 2 layer. So let's do the exact same thing, apply a layer mask. Let's hold Option and click into it, and then Command V to paste our bitmap halftone texture. If I click off this now, you can see this is now being applied to our design, and this is quite a cool technique, I think. I really like the look that this gives. So let's press Command D to deselect that, and we'll move on to our last technique. So obviously the first 2 techniques we've looked at have been done solely in Photoshop without any kind of external images being used, which is definitely a plus in itself. But one of the most common techniques for creating textures is to use an image of some kind that already has some texture within it. We've already got an image within here, and the beauty of this is that you can take textures from just everyday things that you may have around the house or where you live, and you can create textures from them very easily. Now this is just an image we simply downloaded from Pexels, which is a free stock image website, so that's another example of how you can source images. Of course, the more resolution and the higher the quality of the image, the more detail you're going to get from it, but you can still create textures even from relatively low resolution images. So we're going to take you through our process of converting an image like this into a texture. So what I'm going to do is make 2 duplicates of this first. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to try and even out the light in this image. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of our 3rd duplicated layer. Let's go to the middle one here, and what I want to do is go up to Filter, down to Blur, and then Average. So what this is doing is essentially creating a single color, averaging out all of the colors within the image. Next, I'm going to turn on the top image layer. We're going to go back up to Filter, down to Other, and then I'm going to select High Pass. Now it depends what canvas size you're working with, but I've selected a radius of 100 here. This is going to work just fine. Let's click OK, and now I'm just simply going to change the blend mode to hard light. So we're still basically getting the look of the image. If I turn off these 2 layers though, this is what we started with, and this is what we have now. Much more even lighting, and this is really going to help with one of the techniques that we use later. So what I'm going to do is just select all 3 of those layers and merge them together. The keyboard shortcut for that is Command E, or that's Control E on a PC. Now what's always a good idea from here is to try and add as much contrast as you can. So we've got very light and very dark areas. Like we've explained, this is going to help when it comes to applying it as a layer mask to either show or hide parts of your design. So to do that, I like to simply press Command L or Control L on a PC, and that's going to bring up our levels pop-up here for this layer. I can adjust these 3 sliders here to basically make the shadows darker or the highlights lighter. What I prefer to do though is actually use these eyedroppers on the right hand side. So the one on the left hand side is to select the black point of the image. So if I zoom in, let's just find a dark area of the image, so we'll go right here. If I simply click there, that's setting that area as the black point, and I can also do this with the white point. So I'll select the eyedropper on the right hand side and we'll go to a lighter part of the image, click on that. It's adding loads of contrast. We can still play about with our midpoint as well to add or reduce contrast, but I think for this example this will do just fine. Now we can actually technically just use this as is, as a layer mask. We've got lots of light and dark areas. Now this is technically a color image, although it already looks quite grayscale, but if you're using a color image you can simply go up to Image, Adjustments, and then Desaturate, and that's just going to take any color out. You can see it's removed a lot of blue there. However, if we were to paste this into a layer mask, even if it was color, it will automatically get converted to black and white, so you don't need to worry too much about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Command A again and Command C to copy this just as an example. Let's turn off the visibility of that layer. We'll go to our Design 3 layer. Let's create a layer mask again, holding Option. Let's click into that layer mask and press Command V to paste our image. And if we click out, we're already getting this texture applied, and this is pretty cool. I think this works really quite well. But because we have a lot of grey in the image and not a huge amount of contrast, it is making this design a little bit more pale and difficult to read. So that's where you might want to go an extra step with the image itself. So let's turn on the image again. I'm going to go down to our adjustments layer shortcut in the bottom of the layers panel. So that's the black and white circle. If I click that, we have an option here that says threshold. So if I select that, what that's basically going to do is convert this to be either black or white areas. We have a slider here that we can adjust how much detail is being retained in the shadows and highlights, so we can basically fine tune this. Now, a word of warning, this isn't going to work perfectly for all images, but something like this is working pretty well for. So we're basically simplifying this down, removing all of the grey from the image so that it's either going to be fully visible or completely hidden, which I much prefer in my designs. What we need to make sure we do though is merge these two layers so that we're copying the information from a single layer. So selecting both of them, again I'm just going to press Command E to combine them into a single layer, then Command A to select it, Command C to copy it. Let's turn off the visibility of that layer. We'll press Option and click into our layer mask again, and then press Command V to paste our newly adjusted image into the layer mask. And if I click off that, you can see this is much clearer. I think it's got much more contrast in it and our design is standing out a lot more. Now, one other option, if you want to stop your texture going to the very edges of your design, similar to the stroke technique we looked at, we can equally use an inner glow. So let's do the same thing. We will duplicate this layer by pressing Command J with it selected. So if I double click on the layer again, we're going to get our layer style pop up, and I'm going to select the inner glow option. Now, I already have these settings set up for this example, but again, we want to make sure that our color is set to pure white to show these areas of the design instead of hide them. I've got my blend mode set to normal, my opacity set to 100%, and my noise set to 100%. So that basically means that we're not going to get a gradient or a change in transparency. It's all going to be visible, but we've got this grainy noise being applied, which works in an example like this where we're wanting to apply some rough texture. From there, I like to set the choke to be quite a high percentage. If you adjust this, it's going to vary in the intensity from the outside of the design to the inside, and we can also adjust the size as well. In this case, I want this to be relatively small, not too intense, so something like that. And I can go ahead and click OK, and it's the exact same process. I want to make sure that the fill value of this layer is set to 0% so that only our inner glow is going to be visible, and I need to make sure that I rasterize this layer again. So right click, select rasterize layer style. We're going to press Command A, Command C, Option click into our layer mask, and then Command V. Now we can press Command D to deselect that, and let's click off that layer. I'll also need to turn off the visibility of our top layer, and now we're getting that subtle effect applied. Our texture isn't going right to the edges, but it's not quite as harsh as applying a stroke, so we've still got a little bit of texture, but it's greatly reduced, and I think this is a slightly more natural way of doing it, so it works particularly well for an example like this where we have very fine texture being applied. So that basically rounds up our three favourite techniques for creating distressed textures in Adobe Photoshop. If you want to know how to take these same textures, vectorize them and apply them to vector designs in Adobe Illustrator, we actually already have a video on that, which I will link up at the top of this video somewhere right now. But that's it for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next one. If you want to learn more about graphic design, we've put together a free 1-hour training where you'll discover the top 5 secrets of successful designers, which saves you the hassle of trying to figure it all out for yourself. We'll be showing you how to immerse yourself in the sector you're designing for, creative thinking and how to spark creativity, what good composition is and how you can achieve it in your designs, how to pick the right colours for your designs, and how to pick the right typefaces for your projects. So if you're serious about leveling up as a graphic designer, then make sure to sign up for the next free webinar. Space is limited and these events always fill up fast because they're significantly better than the information others charge you for, and ours is free. The link's in the description, you're not going to want to miss it. I'll see you there.